Hi. As I was saying, um, mass publics demand that their governments safeguard them, and neither international institutions nor the governments which have ceded sovereignty and agreed to economic integration managed by international institutions can be held accountable as easily. Roderick, in 2001, thus formalizes Ruggie's 1982 and 1991 arguments about embedded liberalism as follows. If we want democratically active civil societies, we can have either integrated national economies or independent states. If we want integrated national economies, we can have either independent states or democratically active civil societies. If we want independent states, we can have either integrated national economies or democratically active civil societies. Neoliberals, therefore, can have two things, but not all three at once. Hence, there are two important trade-offs. For a given level of integrated national economies, the more independent the states, the less active the democratic civil societies. For a given level of independent nation states, the more integrated the national economy, the less active the democratic civil society. And here is where the global democratic deficit mechanisms and thus anti-globalization protests becomes prevalent. Neoliberalism is not the best of all possible worlds because people are complaining about its institutions. The Battle of Seattle, for instance, was a fight about the WTO and global governance. More specifically, while the neoliberal global order might lead to peace, although critics claim that competition among capitalist states is more likely than cooperation among them, and while it might even lead to prosperity, although critics claim that in the race to the bottom the rich get richer and few benefits trickle down to the poor, which is true, the neoliberal global order has produced political instability because it generates redistributive conflicts over the democratic nature of its institutions. Thus, the neoliberal institutional trilemma asserts that the neoliberal rhetoric about democracy exceeds the neoliberal grasp because neoliberal globalization puts democracy in a golden straitjacket constructed by international and state institutions that forces political parties to the median voter while opening up civil society to the proliferation of special interests. In a democracy, that is, neoliberalism contracts political, electoral space, openness to international trade, forecloses Keynesian macroeconomic policies, and welfare state social policies, while neoliberalism expands social, civil society, space, issues of trade, neoliberalism, and capitalism involve more and more constituencies. The spread of democracy, at least a rhetorical part of NIT, has also contributed to the rise of civil society through the call for participation, accountability, and transparency. As cosmopolitan and international consciousness rise, the policy agenda widens even further as more voices demand access. Neoliberal institutional trilemma theories thus suggest that the protest is likely in democracies with integrating economies. In globalized democracies, where international economic integration coincides with threats to state independence, or in globalizing democracies where state independence coincides with poor international economic integration. Further, in the former, globalized and largely northern countries, protesters are likely to make claims that focus on threats to state sovereignty and civil society caused by the integration of national economies, whereas in the latter, globalizing and largely southern countries, protesters are likely to focus on inequality and exclusion in the global market. The highest level of protest is most likely when the NIT is most salient. In globalized democracies during crisis, when state power is noticeably lessened, or in the globalizing democracies when poor international economic integration causes domestic problems like increased unemployment, decreased wages, and increased prices. For instance, unilateral military intervention by a hegemon like the USA is likely to incite northern protests because it makes state sovereignty in a globalized world seem weaker, and domestic economic crises like those in Latin America during the 1990s are likely to spur southern protests because they make southern exclusion from the global market in a globalizing world more salient. Further, globalized democracies, protest coalitions are less likely to involve material interests than globalizing democracies' protest coalitions. Protesters are likely to be opposed to neoliberal globalization to support national autonomy and to support inclusive economic development. And that last sentence I need to research more so I know what some of these people on YouTube are arguing about on some of these issues. And 2.6.2 Attribution of threat to democracy. Activists have also connected protests with the pursuit of democracy, using the threat to democracy attribution mechanism. Activists argue they are targeting a global economic system which threatens the sovereignty of the people and claim that they desire democratic institutional changes in these MEIs. Danner and Burbach, 2000. Excuse me. Dissent is framed as a struggle for democracy as depicted in the following quotes. Most civil society groups are all fighting for fundamental democratic rights, and the anti-corporate insurrection is a rebellion that seeks to reclaim democracy. Barlow and Clark, 2002. Danner and Mark, 2003. Further, the Norberg-Hodge indicates how economic integration is tied together with threats to sovereignty and problems of dependence, arguing that economic globalization is leading to the erosion of democracy. 2001. The solution, according to the activists, rests with empowering the people as the ultimate political authority or combating threats to democracy. Brecher, Costello, and Smith in the year 2000. Danner and Mark, 2003. Activists therefore emphasize threats to democracy as a problem and suggest democratic reforms and democratic power to the people as solutions. Academics, on the other hand, focus on groupings of structures of economic integration and democratic civil society that facilitates activists' dissent. Activists and academics are thus connecting problems during economic integration with threats to democracy. Further, both suggest that the solutions lie in people power, dissent, and democratic reforms. While academics put forth the global democratic deficit structural mechanism, focusing on how increasing integration in democratic states leads to dissent, activists suggest the threat to democracy attribution mechanism, which connects economic globalization and democracy through grievances and solutions. And On page 906, 7. The other political market, imperfection, incomplete information. A substantial literature identifies significant development effects from incomplete citizen information, which, in my words, they are not listening to the people anymore. They have built little think tanks and using sociologists, political scientists, and all these other groups charging money for their information to see what they can get away with, or if there's any honest ones, how they can help. But they are not listening to us people anymore. They're listening to people demanding pay for the info and smothering our voices as individuals in America. Okay, let me get back to this. That gets me upset. Substantial literature identifies significant development effects from incomplete citizen information. The other key political market imperfection to which the discussion in this essay gives short shrift. In many ways, however, the foregoing discussion applies equally to information, since the key effect of incomplete information is to prevent citizens from verifying whether politicians have fulfilled their promises. Absent veritability, promises are empty. The presence of uninformed voters distorts political decision-making in at least two ways. First, politicians expend resources to sway uninformed voters. That's when they're hiring these students, or workers now, obligating themselves to special interests in the process. Grossman and Helpman, 1996. Second, politicians simply ignore uninformed voters and are more corrupt. Oh, we got it going here in Oklahoma. Adazara, Boix, and Payne in 2003 written. Or less apt to extend access to government programs. Besley and Burgess, 2002. Stromberg, 2004. The earlier credibility discussion is relevant as well because citizen information is directly susceptible to government influence. Governments can place restraints on the press or on the journalistic access to state secrets. They can favor supporters in allocating rights to media ownership, or they can censor. They can also simply own the media. This turns out to be important because in much of the research in this area, scholars have used newspaper circulation as a proxy for voter information. Newspaper circulation is certainly relevant for development. In 1995, among countries that hold competitive elections, newspaper circulation was much higher and richer than in poorer countries. However, Kiefer shows that the newspaper circulation is much lower in countries in which the market share of government newspapers is higher. The connection between the measurement of information and the earlier credibility discussion is immediate. Information is a public good, and it's also a right. Like all public goods, therefore, it is least likely to be provided, or most likely to be restricted, when political competitors are unable to make credible promises to voters. If this is the case, newspaper circulation may capture the latent credibility of pre-electoral political promises, in addition to, or instead of, extraneous variations across countries and over time in voter information. Consistent with this, Kiefer points to evidence that the negative effects of newspaper circulation on targeted expenditures of government, such as government wages, are exactly what one would predict if newspaper circulation reflected government efforts to influence access to information. And I think a lot of this information is hid, and I think that's why they started charging for TVs to watch a TV and some news and make money off of it. And there's no point in any of these public people getting any more government subsidies for news whether they're propaganda or not, because us poor people that can't pay for a TV don't get it at all. We're being blinded on the side. In conclusion, after decades of research, the theme of democracy and economic development remains as important a topic of investigation as ever. The literature now has rich explanations for why some countries democratize and others do not, why democracy is associated with rapid economic development in some countries and not in others, why policy choices favor development in some democracies and not others. That is, why non-elites will fail to benefit from the policies of elected governments. The conclusion of this essay is that the problem of credible commitment is at the core of each of these advances, but the precise role of commitment differs. The democracy and development literature points to the inability of elites and non-elites to make credible agreements with each other in order to explain why some countries have successfully democratized. These same arguments do not explain as easily performance variation among democracies. Poorly performing democracies do not seem to exhibit the inequality, distributive tendencies, and conflict over redistribution between elites and non-elites that this literature predicts. Other arguments focusing on the credibility of promises from politicians to supporters, e.g. from the leaders of non-elites to the non-elite, can fill this gap. Poor performance emerges in some democracies, not because the conflict between elites and non-elites is more difficult to resolve, but because political competitors are unable to make credible promises to voters in the first place. History matters for the story of democratization as well, since democracies differ significantly in the extent to which they enjoy a legacy of political competitors able to make credible policy commitments to voters, or of patrimonialism that makes politicians reluctant to build up broad credibility with voters. This in turn links back to the literature focused on elites and non-elites, since it is precisely when political competitors can make credible policy commitments that we expect non-elites to be able to act collectively to force elites to give up power. Better understanding these historical links between political credibility and successful democratization is crucial to improving the success of the contemporary efforts by wealthy democracy to deepen democratization among the world's poor countries. And I have no doubt they are using this good information to do their bad and to hide their bad for the corrupt ones. And I wanted to tell you what's all in here. Part 1 is the introduction. Part 2, theory and methodology. And number 2 is multicausality, context, conditionality, and endogeneity. Number 3 is historical inquiry and comparative politics. Number 4, the case study, what it is and what it does. Number 5, field research. Number 6, the science of comparative politics possible. Number 7, from case studies to social science, a strategy for political research. And 8 is collective action theories. Part 3 is states and state formation, political consent. War and trade and state formation, compliance, consent, and legitimacy, national identity, ethnicity and ethnic conflict. And the next part, political regimes and transitions, mass beliefs and democratic institutions. What causes democratization? Democracy and civic culture, dictatorship and analytic approaches. And 5, political instability, political conflict, rethinking revolutions, a neo-Tocquevillian perspective, civil wars, contentious politics and social movements, Mechanisms of globalized protest movements. Part 6, Mass Political Mobilization. The emergence of parties and party systems. Party systems, voters and parties voters in emergent democracies. Political clientelism. Political activism, new challenges, new opportunities. And I believe that's 7, processing political demands. Aggregating and representing political preferences. Electoral systems, separation of power, comparative judicial politics, federalism, coalition theory, and government formation. And the last one, governance and comparative perspective, comparative studies of the economy and the vote, context conditional political budget cycles, the welfare state in global perspective, the poor performance of poor democracies, accountability and the survival of governments, economic transformation, and comparative politics. and also, if you read about this and study on it and find out about political science, then you can start to see who some of the people are called the Big Brother, because they watching us. Have a great evening or morning, wherever you are, day or night. Later.